Hey, it's Mrs. Baranyk. Welcome to the sixth video of my series covering world history before 1200. In the classical era so far, we've covered the Persians and the Greeks, so it's time for the Romans. Roman history is long, like 1,000 years long. While Rome has its roots in the 8th century BCE, according to their own mythology about the founding of the city of Rome, the Roman Empire didn't become a big deal until the 3rd century BCE. Up until that time, they were mostly conquering the Italian peninsula, but in 246 BCE, they went to war against a neighbor who they perceived as a threat, the Carthaginians in North Africa. The two powers went to war on and off for 100 years, and by 146 BCE, North Africa and a few Mediterranean islands belonged to Rome. This started their long history of conquest. They conquered the Greeks and most of the empire of Alexander the Great. A lot of Greek culture was incorporated into the Roman Empire as there were Greek city-states on the Italian peninsula before the Roman Empire existed, and the Romans thought they had cool stuff. In the same way that the U.S. government borrowed democracy from the Greeks, it also borrowed from the Romans. The first government of the Romans was a republic. This is a government where the people vote for the representatives who decide on the laws instead of voting for them directly. The Roman government even had 3 branches of government, including a senate, much like the U.S. government. And there were checks and balances. Eventually, however, the system became corrupt and was controlled entirely by the wealthiest citizens. Civil wars continually weakened the Roman Republic until Julius Caesar took control. His rule was short as he was assassinated by his enemies, but his adopted son, who was actually his great-grandnephew, it's complicated, Augustus, eventually took control of the government, and he made it seem like the Republic was still intact by having a Senate, but in reality, he made all the decisions and the Roman Republic was over. Rome now had an imperial government led by an emperor. The word emperor even comes to us from Latin, the language of the Roman Empire. Imperator was the Latin word for the head of the Roman army, and that's where we get emperor. And let's talk about the Roman army for a minute. It was the great strength of the empire. If the Persians relied on overwhelming numbers, the Romans relied on discipline, organization, and overwhelming numbers. They also copied the effective weapons of their enemies whenever they could to increase their arsenal. Now, it's said that the Romans never turned and fled from an enemy, although there are probably Roman historians out there who can tell me that that's not true. The reign of Augustus also ushered in a time called the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. This was about 200 years where the Roman Empire was mostly at peace. Trade flourished in this time, including long-distance trade with India and the Han Dynasty of China, who we'll talk about in a later video. By the 2nd century CE, Rome covered all the territory you see on the maps above. It was so large that it was hard to administer and to get around. Check out this map of the Roman Empire over the United States and remember that this was before there were cars or phones. In order to get around, like the Persians, the Romans built a series of roads. Some of these roads are still around today. The Romans were also the inventors of concrete, so maybe that helps to explain it. Anyway, like the Persians, the Romans divided their empire into 46 provinces and had an enormous bureaucracy to watch over and administer these vast lands. Roman society was deeply divided between 2 groups, the patricians, who were supposedly could trace their lineage back to the founding families of the Roman Empire, and the plebeians, who represented everyone else. The patricians tended to be very rich, and the plebeians tended to be very poor. Additionally, Rome had an enormous number of enslaved people who were part of the empire. Somewhere between 25 and 40% of Roman society was enslaved. Enslaved people were prisoners of war, people convicted of crimes, or people who were deeply in debt. While some did the hard labor we associate with slavery, like working in mines or on huge farms, others worked in households, or highly educated people who were enslaved after a conquest, especially those from Greece, were often used as the tutors for the children of the rich. Like most empires of this era, the Romans were highly patriarchal, with women being under the guardianship of a male family member their whole lives. They were never equal in status to men, although they did have some legal control over property that they inherited. Religion in the Roman Empire is really fascinating. Initially, the Romans were polytheistic, but by 63 BCE, they had conquered Judea and added a large number of Jews into the empire. Recognizing Judaism as an ancient religion, it was one of the few legal religions of Rome. However, after the Roman government became imperial, they started to deify their dead emperors, meaning that they turned them into gods. It became a civic obligation to pay tribute to the deified emperors. This was called Caesar worship, and Roman citizens were required to turn in proof of their Caesar worship, basically a receipt with their taxes. As monotheists, the Jews could not do this, and thus they were seen as unpatriotic and problematic. They started rising up against the Roman Empire, and this is the world that Jesus was born into. Although, as a Jew, his name was probably Yeshua, a Hebrew version of Joshua. Jesus is the Greek version of his name since the New Testament, the holy book of Christianity, was first written in Greek. Jesus lived and was killed in the Roman Empire, and over the next 2 centuries, Christianity, a new religion based on his teachings, started to spread throughout the Roman Empire. The areas in orange on this map are where there were sizable Christian communities by the 4th century. The Romans were pretty confused about Christianity at first. Since Jesus had been Jewish, a lot of Judaism made its way into Christianity, and the Romans thought that Christians were just a Jewish cult, but eventually they realized that this was a whole new religion. By the 4th century, the Roman Empire was breaking down. Between civil wars where armies kept trying to put their commanders onto the throne, invasions by Germanic groups north of the border, invasions by the Huns, plagues, and more, Rome was in really bad shape. And this is actually when Christianity started to appeal to the people widely. It helped people make sense of the suffering they were experiencing and promised them a better afterlife. This is also when Christianity was finally legalized. Up until this point, Christian communities had practiced in secret, and Christians had been persecuted by Romans on and off for centuries. And by the 5th century, Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire. This meant that to live in the empire, you were expected to be a Christian, which made life pretty hard for the non-Christians. See that building at the bottom of the screen? That's the Pantheon. It's one of the best examples of Roman architecture that's still standing in its entirety. It started off as a Roman temple to the many gods they worshipped, but in 609 CE, it was turned into a church, which saved it from being destroyed in the Middle Ages. Some people say that the Roman Empire fell and the Middle Ages began in 476 CE when a Germanic general claimed the throne of the Roman Empire, but others say that the empire lived on until 1453 CE. See, when we talk about the fall of the Roman Empire, we're really talking about the fall of the western half of the empire. The eastern half of the empire was wealthier, being closer to important trade routes like, you guessed it, the Silk Road, and was able to survive long past the fall of the west to Germanic peoples. While the people in the east spoke Greek instead of Latin, they still considered themselves Romans. But we'll start calling them the Byzantine Empire at this point, and come back for video 7 where I'll start talking about the amazing empires of Asia.